The blast hit like a door slammed by God. Jeffrey Nashton remembered a red flash, and then darkness, the kind that swallowed sound and direction at the same time. He had been a Marine Lance Corporal with 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, asleep on the ground floor in the northeast corner of the battalion landing team barracks near Beirut International Airport. At 6:22 a.m. on October 23, 1983, an attacker drove an explosive-laden truck into the building and detonated it. The concrete structure lifted and collapsed in seconds, 4 stories falling into a crushed stack of floors and rebar. 241 Americans died in the attack, 220 Marines, 18 sailors, and 3 soldiers, but Nashton did not. He was pinned alive inside the ruin. When the building came down, it did not fall neatly. It broke and folded, creating violent pressure points, and, in rare places, small pockets where someone could still breathe. Nashton's pocket was tight. Concrete and twisted metal pressed close around his body, locking his legs and hips so he could not pull free. Dust poured into his mouth and nose. His eyes burned. Concrete splinters and debris temporarily blinded him, and he could only sense the world by pain, vibration, and sound. He tried to inhale and felt his chest resist against the weight. He forced himself to take smaller breaths, afraid that any big movement would shift the slab above him and finish the job. Above the rubble, the world moved fast. Survivors who had been outside or thrown clear started digging within minutes, clawing at chunks of concrete with their hands, prying with anything that could wedge into a crack. Combat engineers and maintenance personnel dragged jacks, torches, and pry bars from vehicles. Navy medical personnel set up triage points. Helicopters began lifting the wounded out. Lebanese civilians and other members of the multinational force rushed in. Heavy equipment was needed, but the wreckage was unstable. Every lift risked another collapse. Down where Nashton was trapped, time stretched into something cruel. The air tasted like powdered cement. His throat felt raw. His body hurt in places he could not reach. He could not see enough to tell whether the darkness was day or night. Sometimes he heard voices, muffled, distant, then nothing but the soft grind of debris settling. At other moments, a tremor ran through the pile as if someone had stepped on the roof of his grave. He tried to call out when he could, but the dust made his voice thin. He did not know if anyone heard him. The hours after the bombing were chaos, but the chaos had a direction: find the living before the rubble crushed them or they ran out of air. Rescuers listened for tapping, for faint shouting, for anything that signaled a pocket. They pulled out men wedged between slabs and others buried to the neck. They also pulled out bodies, so many that it became impossible to keep names straight. In the confusion, dog tags were found and misread. Some families were told the wrong status of their loved ones. Around the wreckage, the smell of fuel and dust mixed with the sharp odor of pulverized concrete. Nashton fought the same enemy every trapped survivor fought: panic. Panic wasted air and made people thrash, and thrashing shifted rubble. He tried to stay still. He focused on what he could control, breathing shallow, keeping his jaw closed to keep dust out, listening for the scrape of tools. His eyes ached. He blinked into darkness and saw nothing but occasional flashes when dust shifted and a thin line of light appeared, then disappeared again. At some point, the rescue effort changed tone. The easy recoveries were over. The remaining voids were deeper, buried under slabs that only cranes could move. Heavy equipment arrived at the site, and cranes began lifting sections of concrete that had weighed too much for human strength. Work slowed because slow was safer. Men shouted measurements. They wedged timbers under slabs before lifting. They pumped air into gaps. They paused when they heard a sound below that could be a voice or could be the pile settling. For Nashton, that meant long stretches of stillness and then sudden jolts. When a crane lifted a slab somewhere above him, the debris around his body shifted. Pain flared. Dust rained again. He tried to keep his breathing even. He had no water. His mouth felt like sandpaper. The inside of his lips cracked. He swallowed and felt nothing. The first night passed, then another morning. The rescue and recovery operation continued for days after October 23rd, even as the chances of finding someone alive shrank with every hour. Men worked under floodlights, digging until their hands bled, lifting concrete in careful increments. Most of the building had collapsed into a dense stack, and many had died instantly from crushing injuries. Still, rescuers kept listening, because every so often, a faint sound came from below. When they finally reached Nashton, it was not a triumphant moment with space to breathe. It was a delicate extraction in a tight void, the kind where a wrong pull could break a trapped person's body further. Rescuers spoke to him as they worked, letting him know they were there. Light cut into his pocket in a thin blade. Fresh air hit his face. He tried to lift his head, and pain anchored him back. The concrete that had pinned him had to be moved in sequence. They lifted and blocked, making room for his body without letting the pile collapse. When they freed him enough to slide him out, he was severely injured. He had been crushed and trapped, and his body had been fighting shock the entire time. Medics moved quickly, because freeing a person after prolonged crushing can trigger life-threatening complications. They stabilized him and evacuated him for treatment. Later, Nashton would tell reporters what he remembered: the red flash and the darkness, the sense of being on the ground floor when the building folded over him, his temporary blindness, the crushing debris, the long entrapment. These were not details a person invented for drama. They were the physical reality of a structure collapsing around a human body. The bombing itself was one of the deadliest attacks on U.S. forces since World War II. The truck bomb's power was catastrophic, collapsing the barracks so completely that many victims could not be recognized without careful identification. In the aftermath, the United States reassessed its presence in Lebanon, and the Marines eventually withdrew. But for the men who lived through it, policy decisions did not change what they carried. Nashton's survival did not end when he reached daylight. Recovery from crushing injuries is slow and brutal. Bones take time, nerves take longer, some damage never fully reverses, and the mind keeps its own record. The darkness, the weight, the feeling of air running out, the knowledge that you are not alone under the rubble and that the voices you hear may stop. Yet he had lived. In a disaster where so many were lost instantly, he lasted through the collapse and through the hours that followed, until rescuers found his pocket and refused to quit. The building that fell on him did not get to decide the ending. Jeffrey Nashton survived the Beirut Marine Barracks bombing by inches, by stubborn breath, and by the hands that kept digging. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.